Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's lecture that finishes up our discussion on Puerto Ricans in the U.S. From the reading, there was this quote that I think encapsulates sort of the economic relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. When the U.S. economy catches a cold, the Puerto Rican economy gets pneumonia. And we saw in the readings exactly how that manifests itself through the different recessions the U.S. has had, and the most recent fiscal crisis that is taking place in Puerto Rico. So in terms of the fiscal crisis, the factors contributing to the economic collapse include industries leaving the island as tax incentives disappeared and the elimination of Section 936. If you recall, we talked about the various tax incentives that were given decades ago to American corporations to open up in the island to create jobs. Well, there was a deadline to those incentives, and so those incentives have run out. And as soon as those ran out, those corporations started leaving the island and going to other places in the world where they could get cheaper labor. The governments therefore took on the role of employers, so that a large percentage of the population in Puerto Rico is actually hired by the government into government work. Eventually, this was overtaxing for the budget of the government. There was also an increased demand on government services as a result of people losing their jobs. So in order to make up for the default, the government began borrowing in order to keep up with the expenses. This also became exacerbated by the Great Recession of 2008. So eventually, this all led to the island a few years ago declaring essentially bankruptcy, the governor announcing that there was no money and that they would not be able to pay back their debts. And this put the island into a fiscal crisis that required the U.S. government to intervene. And so this resulted in the PROMESA legislation that was passed in 2016. PROMESA stands for the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act. The legislation was passed in Congress, which created a control board to take over the economic management of the island. The board consists of all Americans, none of them are Puerto Ricans, and the governor holds a non-voting seat. Among the policies that the PROMESA board has implemented includes lowering the minimum wage of workers on the island. Critics of the bill argue that it represents a brazen effort to undermine the democratic process, as the unelected members largely have unfettered control over Puerto Rico's budget and finances. And it has been equated to the centralized control created with the Foraker Act of 1900. So people feel like we've gone back in time in terms of Puerto Rico having any kind of autonomy. The kinds of measures that this board has put in place have been quite austere because the focus isn't on the people and making things better for the people financially, but purely on squeezing the population of as much money as possible to pay hedge fund operators and other investors the debt that is owed to them. This became even further exacerbated with Hurricane Maria, which took place in the fall of 2017. This devastating hurricane, which was a Category 5 hurricane, brought a huge amounts of destruction to the island, and it ended up exacerbating the economic crisis that was already unfolding. Colonial laws impact the immediate response after the hurricane. Those shipping rules that we talked about before through the Jones Act of 1920, which required that all ships coming to the U.S. territories must be American ships, resulted in delays in getting necessary goods to the island immediately after the hurricane. So there were boats ready to bring goods from Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean and South America, for example, but because those ships were not coming under U.S. flags, they would not be allowed to come to the island. Status as a second-class citizenship was made even more evident not only by the insensitive comments made by Donald Trump at the time, but also by the inefficiencies of FEMA in providing a rapid response to the crisis. The photograph you see here is of the mayor of San Juan at the time, Yulín Cruz, with a bullhorn, using it to search for people that needed help. She was called, quote unquote, nasty by President Trump for her being critical of Trump's administration during the hurricane response. What this all also made really evident was the weakness of the infrastructure overall on the island. The island lost power. Some parts of the island lost power for almost a year. And it was extremely difficult and slow moving to get to different parts of the island to reconnect people to electricity. Other folks lost water, so they weren't getting water into their homes. And that's for the people who were not dealing with homes that were destroyed or flooded, as you see there in the image. Approximately 3,000 people died in some way impacted by the hurricane. One of the other issues that has been discussed in relation to Puerto Rico has been what is called a demographic winter, where increasingly the elder population has a longer life expectancy, but there's a decrease in fertility rates over the last few years. And there's also been an increase in migration as a result of both the fiscal crisis and Hurricane Maria, particularly to Florida this time. And so what that has meant is that there is a imbalance in the population in Puerto Rico, where a large number of the elderly are being left behind, a large number of the poor that don't have resources to, pay for a flight to leave the island are left behind, and many of the professional class has been leaving. So some of the effects after the hurricane has been a large number of hurricane refugees moving to Central Florida in particular, raising questions about whether the increase in more Democratic-leaning Latinos will have a future impact in Florida politics. So there's been a lot of talk, discussion, observation of this particular population in Florida and how it might impact politics there. There's been an ongoing decline in the island of public services. The electric company has been privatized. There was also, a few months after the hurricane, a rise in earthquakes that added to the infrastructure instability. Overall, there's been a declining trust in the government by people in Puerto Rico, especially as it's been discovered over the last few years of significant corruption by politicians, even of politicians who abused some of the resources that were being sent to help with the post-hurricane efforts. The population has also been suffering from the effects of trauma. People would describe what the hurricane experience was like for them. The incredible roar of the winds of the hurricane. And so when now any tropical storm or any hurricane is headed their way, it triggers, right, certain responses to them, both physically and mentally, after having experienced this catastrophic hurricane. And as we've seen in the last few years, hurricanes continue to get more and more aggressive and have become very large storms and very destructive storms. This lack of trust in the government manifested itself in what has been called Boricua Summer, where the governor at the time, Ricardo Rosselló, joked about Hurricane Maria victims and made homophobic, transphobic, and misogynistic comments in some chats that he was having with other administrators in the government. These chats were leaked and became public information. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. People were already unhappy with him and his administration because of the corruption, because of how badly post-hurricane efforts had been going. And these leaked chats just made it even that much worse and more real to the population that they had a governor that did not care about the people. So this led to weeks of protests throughout the islands, people calling for his resignation, people complaining about the corruption in government. And this eventually leads to the governor resigning a week after the protests. More recently, some of the protests we've seen on the island have had to do with the electric company, Luma Energy, which was a private company that took over control of local energy transmission following Hurricane Maria, increased energy prices, and has provided very inconsistent service. Luma is apparently a consortium of Canadian and American companies and was awarded a 15-year contract. This all took place under the Trump administration. So this was basically a kind of deal that was made by the Trump administration to this company to let them take over the energy service in Puerto Rico. It has increased these prices that it's very difficult for people to afford. And the service is inconsistent. There are more power outages there than there are times where they actually have electricity in their homes. So this resulted in a series of protests that have taken place, where people in particular, one of the things they do is they have taken their appliances that have been destroyed as a result of the constant power outages and dumped them in front of the Luma company offices to express their, not just their frustration with the lack of energy, consistency in energy and the price increases, but also the complete lack of care by this company on how these power outages are affecting people's everyday lives. So that is kind of where we are in the situation in Puerto Rico between economic crises, constantly being in the watch for any storms coming their way and the constant impact that those storms now have. Every time that there is a hurricane or a tropical storm, power goes out for a long time, significant flooding takes place all over the island, and roads and bridges and so on fall apart because the infrastructure is so weak. A few years ago when Hurricane Fiona hit, it had pretty much, even though it wasn't as powerful of a hurricane as Hurricane Maria, it pretty much had the same effect as Hurricane Maria because the infrastructure is now so weak. So that's where the situation is in Puerto Rico as we speak. And what all of that means is that all of that ends up having an impact on the people on the island deciding whether to migrate to the United States or not. So it has an impact on Puerto Rican migration and has had an impact not just in Central Florida, but has had an impact in terms of the population that now exists in the United States of Puerto Ricans has increased dramatically over the last few years as a result of all of these things that have been taking place in Puerto Rico. So this ends the lecture for this week. I look forward to hearing your comments or looking at your comments on the discussion post. Have a wonderful week.